Good morning. This is a recap of what we did before the extended spring break. Just wanted to throw this out there for you to remind you of what we've been reading. I will try to mark the page where I'm talking about stuff. For example, there's a story right there. That's how it begins. And it also there's also a question that ends up with right here. How do they feel victimized by and traumatized by graffiti? Okay. Next, the authors try to, in this paragraph, they try to talk about a larger trend and on both sides of the Atlantic. And again, ask the question, what on earth is going on? Okay, so repeat the question, specific, and then a larger context here, all right? And then they say, if they ask a question, the reader's looking for the answer, and this can be found in cultural shifts. Word shift, concept creeps. That's how they get to that right there. Once they have introduced the idea of concept creep, cultural shifts equals concept creep, then they give you examples. Bullying is one. And how do they do this? I've talked about this in class. They give an older definition of bullying. Then they give you a newer definition of bullying that has crept outward or horizontally. And then they give you the newest definition here, where if a person believes that he or she has been made to suffer in any way, etc. So this is that expansion they're talking about. So old definition, newer definition, newest definition. And then they follow this organizing principle throughout to the second key concept. And it's very subtle here. They leave a lot of stuff out. So you have to read very closely and carefully to get this. And here's the third key concept, prejudice. So we've got bullying, trauma, and prejudice. And again, the same pattern. Old, slightly newer, and newest definition. All of which try to prove the point that it is an expanding, the definition is expanding further and further. It's creeping outward. Okay. Then comes a big shift here. They make this assertion that concept creep does not happen to all psychological terms, primarily to what sociologists call a culture of victimhood. That's really important that you understand, or try to understand, from their definition of this. Remember, they're trying to introduce lots and lots of terms here, and it's tough. You know, they've got a tough job as a writer. So, you might say that what the authors are saying is that this culture of victimhood has two parts. You're either a victim or you stand up for victims. And that these don't emerge just everywhere. Most institutions, they don't emerge. But in places like Emory and Yale, the culture of victimhood has been, as some people say, weaponized. And that's what they say is concept creep serves as a rhetorical weapon of victimhood culture. All right. So then they say once you understand the culture of victimhood, you can understand all the new concepts that are emerging on campuses. So it's going to introduce even more concepts. okay, if this is true, if there is a culture of victimhood on campuses, if people are being victimized, you know, it says here rife with bullying and prejudice. Well, and they're easily traumatized, then what should we do? We should provide safe spaces where nobody will say things that might make them feel marginalized. Sometimes they say the whole students want their entire campus to be a safe space. And a safe space from any possible kind of traumatizing ideas. In fact, they advocate for deplatforming, or by shouting people down who do speak in opposition. The authors note that this desire for safe space explains things like trigger warnings. And just a second before I go on, I do want to remember to include the fact that for each of these concepts, like bullying, ultimately the definitions get applied to explain why Emory students felt the way they did. In each one of these concepts, at the end, they talk about Emory students. And here, Emory students. So that's part of the organization there. I forgot to mention that, and I wanted to come back to it. Okay. These trigger warnings are not only for extreme events, but the author suggests that it is for protecting students from any negative emotions, and that the bar is lowered for bullying, trauma, and prejudice, so that all people will be protected. And then they say that, regrettably, that's a loaded word if there ever was one, the result of these trigger warnings is that they may do more harm than good. The authors note this researcher, Ian Hacking, and they don't really tell you why they note that until a little bit later, but they talk about Ian Hacking's idea of looping effects and how people come to see themselves through the lens of a new concept. Well, of course, he's already introduced four big concepts that you could apply here. So, you know, news concepts might be, I see myself through the eyes of bullying, I see myself through the eyes of trauma, I see myself through the eyes of victimhood, I see myself through the eyes of being triggered. And then it goes back to Trump 2016 and tries to explain this from the idea of looping effects. You know, we see ourselves as aggrieved and fragile victims. And we also can get a moral platform, like the Emory students did, and you get to call because you're a victim, or you're protecting victims, because that's what you do in a culture of victimhood, they get to call everybody else bullies, traumatizers, and aggressors. All right. This is a polarizing image. They note, and the effect of it is to shut down free speech in the marketplace of ideas. Now remember, I'm not saying this is true or not. I'm just saying this is what they say. It sounds a little bit troll-like here. Of course, we don't mean that young people don't experience some harm, but this overprotection is harmful. That's what they're going to get at. This is the second half of the article. They bring in an expert, Nassim Taleb, And they talk about how you don't need to coddle people. What you need to do is to help them get stronger by giving them jolts to the system, much like a pathogen does for the immune system, or a bone that's broken grows back stronger. You kind of drop it there and say that the university that protects students, so-called protect students, are doing them greater harm when they leave the university and go into the workplace. And that's when they need to be strong, and we have rendered them weak, according to the authors, by this culture of victimhood. They go on to say that yes, there are indignities, there are problems on campuses, and it's hard to argue against the fact that black and Muslim students have been subjected to these indignities. But, and there's a big but right there, it says, but universities should be careful not to encourage all these things, this victimhood culture, this looping effects, and greater fragility. You see how they circle back to the organization of the article, which is quite good. And then, out of the blue, they say one step, which of course means that here's a solution. And in fact, they have 3 solutions. First one, second one, third one. And until we reached this point, we hadn't realized that this was a problem solution, or I hadn't realized that this was a problem solution type article. But apparently it is. And at the end, they recap everything with a restatement of their thesis, that helping people weaponize the culture of victimhood is more dangerous than anything written in chalk. In other words, getting used to opposing ideas, even ones that are written in chalk, only written in chalk, is our safety in disguise. And they wait till the very end to say this again. They sort of say it at the beginning, but that's a rundown of the organization of the article.